The wind pressed cold against the warped wood of the Maynard attic, whistling through slits where nails had lifted long ago. Dust spiraled slowly in golden shafts of winter light, and beneath the slanted ceiling Eloise Maynard sat on a quilt too thin for the season, her back against the wall, one hand pressed to the swell of her belly. 7 months along, maybe more, she'd lost track. Time was measured differently now, not by calendars or church bells, but by the creak of Cora's steps on the stair, the silence after soup was left outside the door, the scrape of a lock being turned. No one called her by name anymore. Once she'd been a bride in lace, a girl whose laughter floated over the dry grass and painted the world in color. Now her reflection in the attic's narrow mirror, a shard half buried in a drawer, was someone else entirely, pale lips, hollowed cheeks, eyes sunken like candle stubs in the dark. She ran her hand over her roundness, skin stretched and warm, and whispered to the child, "I'm still here. Don't forget me." Outside, the bell from St. Simeon's rang slow and distant. The town gathered for Sunday sermon while she remained a ghost above their heads, locked away like a sin. The door opened just wide enough for a bowl to slide in. Cora didn't speak. She never did. The woman had eyes like river rocks, flat, dull, unmoved. Once, Eloise had begged her for a letter, for word of her husband. The slap that followed came quick and clean, like she was erasing chalk. The bowl was thick with root stew and little salt. She forced it down slowly. Anything not eaten was noted, punished. Sometimes by silence. Sometimes by words that cut deeper than hunger. "Your shame is ours," Cora had once hissed. "You think you're owed sympathy? You seduced a Maynard and look what's come of it. You want pity? Pray." But she did pray. Not for pity, but for someone to remember her as she was. Before the wedding night. Before he rode away. Before Reverend Maynard took one look at the blood on the sheets and decided she was no wife at all. A beam above her head bore a child's carving, M and B, locked in a heart. Probably someone else's initials. But she traced them like they were hers, and as they once might have been in another life. She leaned close to the slatted window and pressed her face to the cold glass. From here she could just barely see the road that led down from the ridge. The same road had disappeared down 3 months after their vows. One letter came, then nothing. Rumors followed. Bounty hunters, a duel gone wrong, debts too deep to outrun. Some said he was dead. Some hoped he was. She no longer knew which she believed. A voice drifted up from below, Rosie, the neighbor girl, singing softly as she walked past the house with her rag doll. 6 years old, barefoot in snow, loved more than Eloise had ever been under this roof. She pressed her palm to the glass, but the girl didn't look up. No one ever did. That was the point. The attic kept the Maynard name clean. No scandal on the church rolls, no whispers in the general store. Just a girl tucked upstairs, hidden with the spare linens and old trunks. The sun lowered toward the hills, softening the edges of the world. Eloise clutched her shawl tighter and lit the single candle she was allowed. The flame flickered uncertainly, as if even it felt unwelcome. And then she saw it. A man rode slowly into view, horse dark and dust-colored, coat stiff with weather. He didn't look up, just passed beneath the sycamore with a weight that made his shoulders seem carved from stone. But there was no mistaking the way he carried his left side, just a fraction slower. No mistaking the long scar that curved from cheekbone to jaw. Her breath caught, fragile and unfinished. She didn't scream. Didn't call out. Just pressed her forehead to the glass as if it might open. His head turned slightly as he reached the crossroads, as though something called to him, invisible and faint, but he didn't stop. He disappeared behind the mercantile. She pressed a hand to her belly. The baby kicked. It was the first time in weeks. Below, the house creaked with cold, the walls breathing like an old man trying to remember warmth. Cora's voice drifted up, stern, hurried. "He's back. The prodigal ghost." Then silence. The word back echoed in her ribs. A long time ago, had touched her face like it was a prayer and said he'd never leave. That promises meant more than paper. That he'd come back when it was safe. But safe from what? He never told. Just kissed her slow that last night and rode away before dawn. Her letters went unanswered. Her name was stripped from town gossip and family grace. When her belly began to show, the judgment came swift. The shame was branded on her like a cattle mark. She stood now, legs unsteady, and walked to the little drawer where she kept scraps of paper. Letters she'd written but never sent. Pieces of herself stitched into words she feared no one would read. She picked up the one she started the day her husband vanished, dated 2 winters past. Folded it gently and slid it beneath the floorboard. If she died here, someone should know what she tried to say. A soft knock startled her. She froze. No one knocked. She approached the door slowly, heart rising like a bird flushed from brush. Another knock, gentle, deliberate. Not Cora. Not the Reverend. She placed her ear to the wood. Silence. Then, just barely, something slid under the door. A single envelope. No name, no seal. She waited. Counted to 50. Opened it. Inside, a piece of paper, folded once, trembling with cold. On it, I'm not gone. And you're not forgotten. Her knees buckled. She fell against the door, pressing the note to her chest like it might restart her heart. Downstairs the fire crackled. Footsteps moved. Doors opened and closed. But above them all, in a space meant to contain shame, a spark returned. She whispered his name once, not a prayer, not a plea. Just memory given breath. Outside, snow began to fall. She sat near the slats in the window again, watching the white cover the world. And for the first time in a long time, she waited for morning. Not as punishment, but as promise. The man in the dust-colored hat rode into town like a secret coming home. No trumpet, no trail of smoke, just the creak of a worn saddle and the low breath of a horse that had seen too many miles. His coat was stained at the edges with road and weather, and one side of his face caught the sun wrong, scarred, like lightning had tried to write something across it and gave up halfway. McAllister didn't speak when the stable hand offered to tie up his horse. He simply nodded once, handed over the reins and walked toward the churchyard. The bell tower stood crooked, a bird's nest tucked near the top beam. The town hadn't fixed it in years, but it still rang on Sundays, still made folks pretend they were something cleaner than dust and pride. Stopped at the iron gate, stared at the cracked headstone just inside. Amelia Jane, beloved wife and mother. Not his kin. Not anyone's he knew. But he stood there like it gave him permission to return. Folks watched. From behind curtains, from porch rockers, from inside the general store. A few whispered, "Is that McAllister? I thought he was dead. Didn't he run off with silver from Carson's safe?" The truth didn't matter here. Stories moved quicker than horses and they never needed saddles. Walked past the church and sat on a bench beneath a withered cottonwood. The wood groaned under his weight as if surprised it was still needed. He pulled a small tin from his coat, lit a match and took a long, quiet drag from a hand-rolled cigarette. The smoke curled slow around him, softening his scarred face like a veil. His eyes stayed on the hill to the north, where the Maynard house stood like a judgment passed down from heaven itself. He had left her there. And now she was up in that attic. He hadn't known until yesterday. Word reached him through a telegraph clerk outside St. Helena. The clerk's sister lived here. Mentioned a girl locked in a room for shaming the family. Pregnant, alone. The story had a name, though the clerk didn't speak it. But knew. He'd known the minute he read the words Maynard attic. Eloise. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back, listening. The town hadn't changed. Same brittle wind. Same hush that wrapped itself around your boots and asked you to forget where you'd come from. He felt the weight in his coat pocket. A letter, and signed, unwitnessed, written to the child he hadn't met. A small voice startled him. "You came back," said the girl, no more than 6, standing barefoot in the cold with a doll missing an eye. He looked at her, surprised. "You know me?" She shrugged. "No. But the lady in the attic talks about you when she sings." He didn't answer right away. Just studied her. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her dress was patched in 3 places. She looked like she lived just outside of people's kindness. "What's your name?" "Rosie," she said, swinging the doll by its arm. "She cries sometimes. The lady. I seen her through the attic slats. Sometimes I wave. I think she waves back, but maybe she's brushing hair." His jaw clenched. "Does anyone else know?" Rosie kicked the dirt. "My mama says not to talk about the Maynads. She says they keep clean by keeping others dirty." That sounded about right. He reached into his coat, pulled out a wrapped caramel and held it out. Rosie hesitated, then took it and curtsied like she'd been taught better days ago. "Thank you, mister." Stood, watched her wander off. Then he turned and walked toward the Maynard property, boots crunching over gravel like slow thunder. He didn't go to the front. Not yet. He stopped just beyond the gate, stared at the house. It loomed tall, all stern lines and shutters drawn tight like lips refusing to speak. No smoke from the chimney. Just stillness. But upstairs, near the corner window, a sliver of curtain had moved. He stepped closer. She was there. Pale against the glass, eyes wide as winter sky. Her fingers touched the pane as if they could cross distance, could brush his cheek like they used to before shame built walls higher than fences. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just looked at her like a man trying to remember how to breathe. Inside, she vanished from view. Exhaled, turned, and walked toward the old fence on the side yard. It leaned like it had given up. He pressed a palm to one of the posts. The wood was soft with rot. He found a loose rail and lifted it. The next morning, folks found at the fence with a hammer and nails. He said nothing, just worked. One board, then another. Each one straight. Each one set like he owed someone something he couldn't name. By sundown, he had the whole section mended. On the third day, he left a red apple on the gatepost. The fourth, a small shawl, hand-stitched. He traded for it in town. No one saw him leave the gifts, but Eloise found them. Each one. Her hands trembled when she lifted the shawl, pressed it to her cheek, and rocked slowly on the attic floor, the child stirring against her ribs. He didn't come to the house again that week. Not close. Just stood at a distance, watching, measuring the space between past and forgiveness. On the seventh night, when the moon was thin and cruel, the attic light flickered like a heartbeat. Stood near the cottonwood, hat low, coat pulled tight. He didn't know if she could see him. He hoped she could. Cora Maynard stood on the porch, arms crossed. "He won't stay," she said to the air. But the air didn't answer. The town was too quiet for that. Too used to forgetting its sinners. Eloise wrote that night in the dark. No ink. Just pressure of pen against old paper, words she traced over and over. She didn't need to read them. She'd memorized them long ago. The child kicked again. Stronger this time. She whispered, "He's come back, little one." Whether that means hope or more heartbreak, I don't know. But he's here. 3 nights later, the pipe burst in the kitchen. Cold snapped it clean. Water pooled beneath the floorboards. Cora and the Reverend left for town. That's when came. Not like a hero. Not with fists or fury. He knocked once. Soft. Eloise froze. The candle had long burned out. She moved toward the door like in a dream. His voice low. "If you want me gone, I'll go. But I never forgot." Silence. Then the lock turned. The door creaked open. He stood there, taller than she remembered, scar catching the light, eyes hollow but steady. He looked at her like she was made of breath and bone and sorrow, and he had missed every part. She didn't speak. Just stepped aside. He didn't enter. Not fully. He placed something on the attic floor. A sealed letter. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Just wanted you to know. I kept something for you." Then he left. She knelt beside the letter, hands trembling. Inside a deed. Signed in his name. Transferring his land to the child's name upon birth. Witnessed by the sheriff, notarized in the next county. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise. Downstairs, the house sighed with cold wind returning. But above it, in that quiet room, a woman closed her eyes and wept without shame. And somewhere beyond the trees, McAllister walked into the night, the weight of the past lighter by one step. The next morning, frost clung to the window panes like lace stitched by sorrow. Inside the attic, Eloise sat cross-legged on the quilt, the letter from resting open in her lap, creased at the corners where her hands had trembled too long. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, his voice returned, not just the words but the way he'd spoken them. Gentle. Bare. As though anything louder might break the world apart. Downstairs, footsteps moved with clipped intent. Cora. The woman's heel struck with like accusations. There was no mention of the burst pipe, no apology for the cold that had crept into the attic like a second skin. Just a bowl of gray porridge pushed through the door and the sound of the lock twisting shut again. Eloise didn't eat. She pulled the shawl had left around her shoulders and moved to the small vent slats near the window. Below, the world was still. No voices. No wheels. No church bells. Just winter breathing across the land like it owned everything. Then movement. He was at the side of the house, coat buttoned high, hands bare against the cold. He carried a long plank of wood and knelt beside the fence where it had splintered anew. His work was quiet, precise, each nail driven not in haste, but with intent, as if every board he mended restored a part of something lost. He didn't look up. Not once. Eloise watched him for an hour, maybe more, until the ache in her knees reminded her she hadn't moved. When he finally stood, brushing snow from his sleeves, he left something behind. A parcel, small, wrapped in canvas. He didn't wait to see it taken. She waited till the moon rose before she dared open the attic door. No one stirred in the house. Cora and the Reverend had left for prayer circle, a spectacle of devotion to conceal the rot inside their walls. Eloise crept down the attic stairs for the first time in weeks, toes brushing the floor like they were foreign ground. At the threshold, she paused, heart rattling against her ribs. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway's hush. Outside, the bundle waited, half buried in snow. Inside it, a pair of soft leather gloves, worn but warm, and a small red baby bonnet stitched by hand. The color startled her. She hadn't seen red in so long, not real red. Not color that pulsed like hope. She clutched the bonnet to her chest and wept. The next day she left nothing at the window, but at dusk returned. This time with a loaf of bread, steam still faintly rising from the cloth around it. He placed it on the steps and sat on the porch for a moment, hat in his hands as if listening for something. She didn't show herself. She couldn't. But when he walked away, she watched until he disappeared into the pale light. The pattern continued. Day after day, gesture after gesture. A carved wooden rattle. A candle in a tin. Dried lavender bundled in twine. Each offering left without ceremony, without demand. And still he never knocked again. Only once did he look up. It was near sundown, and snow had begun to fall again in slow, thick flakes. Stood in the yard, his breath curling like ghost speech in the air. Then his gaze lifted, straight to the attic window. Eloise did not flinch. She stood there, silhouetted by the candle behind her, eyes meeting his through layers of glass in silence. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But something shifted, an invisible string between them tightening, not with urgency but with certainty. Later that night she wrote for the child again. He comes without asking. Leaves without anger. And I don't know if that's mercy or punishment, but it makes the air warmer somehow. I don't know if we'll ever be free. But I know now we're not forgotten. By the fourth week a knock did come. That's Cora's. Sharper. You've been stealing from the porch? Her voice cracked the air like a whip. Eloise didn't answer. I told your husband once that your softness would ruin everything. Cora's mouth curled. He didn't listen. But he paid for it. Eloise turned her face toward the window. He's not dead. No. But he's marked. You saw his face, didn't you? Cora leaned in. You think scars change men? They don't. They just change how the world sees them. He's still the same boy who left you when it got hard. Eloise stood. And for the first time in months she met Cora's eyes. Maybe, she said softly. But at least he came back. Cora stiffened. Foolish girl. But Eloise didn't back down. That night, the wind howled hard enough to lift shutters. She couldn't sleep. The baby rolled low, heavy and urgent. She walked slowly to the window and opened it just a crack. The cold burned her throat. She leaned out, looked down. The yard was empty. So, she took a long cord from an old curtain and tied it to the shawl had left. Then carefully she lowered it down from the window, the wool trailing like a flag of surrender. It hung there for minutes. Then from the shadows a hand emerged. Stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and attached something to the end of the cord. A blanket. White, soft, folded. He looked up only once. His eyes reached her like fire without flame. Then he stepped back into the dark and was gone. She pulled the blanket up like a lifeline, trembling, and held it to her face. It smelled of cedar and snow. The next morning the town buzzed. Rosie had told someone. Or someone else had seen on the porch. Whispers stirred again. He's leaving things. For her? Shameless. That whole house is cursed. Reverend Maynard slammed the door that evening when he came home. But Eloise no longer listened through the floorboards. Instead she wrote. To herself. To the child. The words were short. Spare. Like small lights in a mine tunnel. That night she opened the window again. No shawl this time. Just a single sheet of paper folded into a square, held by a clothespin on a string. Hours passed. Then it was gone. And when she woke at dawn, another note was in its place. It said only, I remember the way you danced when you thought no one saw. She laughed aloud. Not because it was funny, but because something long dead inside her had stirred, and it made the air shimmer. The next night she sat by the slats, humming. Rosie waved from the road. Eloise waved back. From his camp just outside town, watched the house glow with soft lamplight. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He knew something had changed. Inside the attic, Eloise cradled the blanket and whispered to her unborn child. Your father has not spoken of love. But he's spelling it out with wood and cloth and silence. And that might be better than any vow ever sworn too loud. She lay back on the quilt, the candle flickering low, and let her hand rest over her belly. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and unending, like time had decided to pause, for just a little while, so love could try again. The attic no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed now, slowly, cautiously, like lungs after a long illness. Light seeped in more freely, through slats that had once been sealed with grime and shame. The single candle had become two, and the floor beneath Eloise's feet no longer felt like punishment but like a space waiting to be redefined. She moved differently too, still careful, still slow but no longer shrinking. The baby's movements had become stronger, more certain, as though it could feel the shift in her spirit and was anchoring itself to her hope. Below, voices rose more often. Not just Cora's sharp commands or the Reverend's mutterings, but other voices, murmurs from town. The kind that traveled through wooden fences, across dust roads, beneath the boots of those who looked too long at the Maynard house and then turned away. Something was being whispered into the town's corners, and it sounded like her name. Eloise first noticed it when Mrs. Tate, the widow who kept to herself, left a warm pie on the Maynard porch and walked away without knocking. Cora found it, scoffed, and threw it into the backyard. But Eloise had seen it from above. Cherry. Still steaming. The next morning she found a note slipped beneath her door in unfamiliar handwriting. Only 5 words. We see you. Keep going. She pressed it to her lips and whispered, "They're watching." Not out of malice. Not anymore. Out of memory. Out of guilt. Didn't come for 3 days after the note. She began to wonder if he'd left again, if the weight of old wounds had sent him wandering. Her hand hovered over the shawl he'd once left, folded now in a chest of small things, the quiet archive of a romance too careful to speak its name. But on the 4th evening she saw him from the attic slats, hat in hand, standing just past the fence line like he didn't know if he belonged anymore. He didn't move closer. He just looked up. One slow glance. His eyes met hers. Then he turned away. Not as retreat. As pause. That night, Eloise left the window open and tied a small note to the string that had once carried blankets and baby bonnets. One word, stay. When she returned in the morning, the note was gone. And beside the string hung a silver locket, tarnished, simple, old. Inside was a folded picture of her. From a fair long ago. When her cheeks still carried the blush of innocence and the wind hadn't yet carved sorrow into her skin. He had kept it all this time. Her fingers trembled. She wore it around her neck without hesitation. Below, town voices rose louder. S' name now carried less contempt and more curiosity. He had visited the blacksmith, bought nails and timber. He had spoken to the sheriff, quietly, firmly. No one knew the conversation's content, only that the sheriff tipped his hat as left, a rare gesture in a town that rarely gave second chances. And then Rosie spoke. The little girl with the doll stood in front of the general store, hands on her hips, and told anyone who'd listened that the lady in the attic had smiled, that she had waved, that she had hair like the inside of a chestnut and sang better than the preacher's wife. Children never knew what secrets to keep. The sheriff passed it on to his wife, who passed it to Mrs. Tate, who passed it into every fabric shop and feed barn for 30 miles. By week's end the town knew. She was still there. Still carrying the child. Still. Reverend Maynard doubled down. He forbade guess. Refused to answer questions. Stood on the church steps and preached about modesty, virtue, and the dangers of fallen women. But even his voice couldn't cover the sound of whispers no longer afraid to be heard. The attic was no longer her cell. It had become her watchtower. That night stood beneath her window again. He didn't call. He didn't knock. He simply waited. When she opened the pane, the cold air rushed in like an old friend. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. "Of what?" "What they'll say. What they'll always say." He took off his hat, held it against his chest. "Let them. I've spent too long listening to everyone but my own heart." She closed her eyes. The baby shifted inside her. "I have a name for her," she whispered. He didn't move. "I want to name her Hope." For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "That's a name worth building a life around." The next morning the sheriff returned. But not for Reverend Maynard. The Reverend stepped out onto the porch, adjusting his collar with fingers that trembled. "You dare question me?" The sheriff didn't raise his voice. "Town's changing. They're asking questions. About her. About the attic. About what's been hidden. She is under my care. She's not your property. I gave her shelter." The sheriff looked up toward the attic window. Eloise was standing there, visible now, fully, no longer a shadow. Her hand rested on the curve of her stomach. Her eyes met his. "She's given this town something to reckon with," the sheriff said. "That takes courage. I'd reckon we owe her the dignity to see daylight." That night left nothing on the porch. No gift. No bread. No note. But she found him just past midnight, kneeling by the willow near the yard. He didn't see her approach from the attic's back stair, the one she hadn't used in months. She walked to him without sound. When he turned, his face changed. Like something inside him had unclenched. You came down. I wanted to remember how it felt to breathe open air. He looked at her hands. One held the baby blanket. The other the locket. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I'm not offering it, she replied. Then a pause. But I'm offering a beginning. They stood there in the snow, not touching, not speaking, just sharing a silence that no longer hurt. The next day, 2 women knocked on the Maynard door. Mrs. Tate and the sheriff's wife. Cora opened it, face like iron. We brought soup, said Mrs. Tate. For the girl upstairs. She doesn't take visitors. We're not visiting, the sheriff's wife replied. We're seeing. From above, Eloise watched it unfold. The tide had turned. Not because of shouts, but because one man had kept returning. Because kindness had worn down stone. Because hope, when offered quietly, could still be heard. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and Mercy stood at the gate, a parcel in his hand. He looked up once more, then tied it gently to the latch. She opened it that night beneath her candlelight. Inside, a simple note in his hand. If I could go back, I'd never leave that room where you first said my name like it meant something. But I'm here now. And I'll stay until you believe it too. She smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because something was no longer broken. And sometimes that's how love begins again. The wind rose hard at dawn, as if it had been holding its breath for too long and could no longer bear the weight of all the things unsaid. The Maynard house stood brittle against the rising gusts, its shutters clapping like startled hands, the chimney groaning under the strain of another storm rolling in. The snow fell sideways, not gentle this time, but slanting and fast, whispering warnings against every window pane. And up in the attic, Eloise felt something inside her shift. Not just the baby, not just the weight of her body, but something deeper, older, more final. She clutched the edge of the dresser for balance as the pain tightened across her back like a band pulled too taut. It stole her breath, left her bent and sweating beneath layers of wool. Her knees buckled once and she barely made it to the quilt, sinking to her side as another wave crested, fiercer than the first. Downstairs, the world remained unaware. Cora was at the parlor window muttering about sinners and scandal. Reverend Maynard read from his prayer book aloud, voice flat, more for performance than devotion. No one noticed the shallow gasps above. No one heard the whisper of her voice as she called out, not for them, but for. Another contraction bent her into herself. This time a small cry escaped, sharp and ungraceful. The child within her was coming, not tomorrow, not later, but now. She crawled toward the attic door, breath ragged, fingers slipping on cold wood. She pounded weakly, then stronger, then louder. Each knock a plea, a rebellion, a declaration. The sound echoed through the bones of the house. Cora stiffened. She's at it again. The Reverend barely looked up. Let her. But Rosie heard it from the snow-covered porch where she played with her doll. Her eyes widened. She ran toward the Maynard fence, bare feet slicing through snow. Had been chopping firewood just down the road. He saw the girl running, waving her arms like a flag of alarm. She's screaming. Rosie cried. The lady in the attic. He dropped the axe and ran. The snow bit hard against his boots as he sprinted toward the house. He didn't wait to knock. Didn't speak. Just shouldered the door open, splinters flying. Cora shouted from the parlor, "You have no right." S voice cut through her like thunder. She's having the child. Everything moved at once. Cora lunged toward the stairs but was faster. He took them 3 at a time, heart hammering, breath short. He found her crumpled near the door, face pale, hair soaked with sweat. Her hands clutched her belly like she was holding back a river. It hurts, she whispered, voice breaking. I know, he breathed. I'm here. He gathered her gently as if she were made of paper and carried her down the stairs. Past the portraits, past the silence, past Reverend Maynard, who rose to block the doorway but faltered when stared him down. Out of the way, said low and final. The Reverend didn't move, but he didn't stop him either. Outside the wind howled. Wrapped Eloise in the thickest blanket he could find and hoisted her into the cart. Rosie helped pile furs around her. The horse took off fast, hooves tearing through snow as drove toward the midwife's cabin on the outskirts of town. The ride was rough. Eloise cried out more than once, biting down on her wrist to muffle the sound. Spoke softly the entire way, not promises, not apologies, just her name over and over like a rope to keep her tethered. At the cabin, the midwife, Madame Wilder, opened the door before they arrived. She took one look at Eloise and nodded. You're just in time. Bring her in. Laid her on the prepared bed, then stepped back, helpless for the first time in years. His hands balled at his sides. His scar ached. His knees wanted to fail. But he didn't move. Hours passed. Each scream from the back room carved another line into his face. Each silence was worse. Finally, just before dusk, the cry of a child pierced the air. It was thin, then stronger, then insistent. Madame Wilder stepped into the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She did it. S. legs gave way slightly. He caught himself on the doorframe. Both? Both are alive, the midwife said. But they need rest. And they need each other. He stepped into the room like it was a church. Eloise was pale but glowing. A different kind of light. Not candlelight. Not fire. But something internal, a glow that comes only from the brink of pain and the bloom of something sacred. She held the baby in trembling arms, and when stepped closer, she didn't flinch. She's beautiful, he whispered, voice cracking. She's hope, Eloise murmured, tears slipping down her cheeks. You gave me her name. And you gave her a father. He reached out and touched the child's tiny hand, barely able to breathe. Then Eloise looked at him with something fierce and quiet in her gaze. I don't need you to save me, she said. But I'd like you to stay. He dropped to his knees beside her. I will, he said. This time I will. Back in town, people gathered slowly. The news traveled fast, faster than snowmelt in spring. Some said the Reverend had tried to stop it. Some said God had stepped in. But no one denied what came next. A week later, stood beside Eloise at the edge of the churchyard, their child in his arms. He didn't wear a new coat. He didn't wash away the scar. He didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was, a man who had once run from love and now chose to run toward it. The townsfolk watched from porches, from behind lace curtains, from the church pews they'd filled for years with judgment. Spoke only one sentence before the sheriff. This is my wife. That is our child. And we are staying. No one objected. And when Eloise walked down the street days later, head held high, baby in a sling across her chest, no one turned away. Rosie ran beside her, proud and barefooted. Mrs. Tate sent fresh bread every morning. Even the Reverend nodded once when they passed. Not because he'd forgiven, but because he'd been left behind. At the edge of town, built a house with his own hands. Each plank a page in a new story. Each nail a promise held firm. The attic in this house had windows wide and open, and it smelled of lavender and baby soap. It was not a place to hide. It was a place to begin. And each night, after the lamp was turned down and the child nestled quiet between them, Eloise would rest her head on his chest and feel the scar beneath his collarbone. She never asked how he got it. She didn't need to. Because some scars don't mark shame. Some scars mark return. Some scars are promises that made it home.